The reason third-party risk is so important to me is both the impact to businesses, but also the opportunity for customers and users to influence our vendors to do better with
Mhm.
security. And so one of the things that stands out to me is really encouraging your vendors to provide least privilege environments. And so secure by default. I want a vendor who's going to enable that I can use SSO, that I can have 2FA. I'd love to see more like device trust options, just to
Mm.
be able to build security around your accounts. I mentioned a little bit about like data minimization earlier, but if you encourage that, no, if you want to get into our systems, like we need to build an API or they need to have options that they cannot be an admin in that tool to be able to pull the metrics, but that they can be a read only. And some people move that direction, but I still see way, way, way too much of the API that requires that it's OAuth with your admin. And that's just really bad practice and creates a huge amount of risk.
Welcome to the season 3 of The Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host and AppSec enthusiast and growth manager at Escape. Today, I'm joined by Rachel Curran, co-founder and CEO of Locktivity, third-party risk management platform, and the former director of risk and compliance and head of Infosec at Logik Systems. She has over a decade of experience leading security and GRC, has built SOC 2 and security programs from infancy to maturity for numerous companies, and is now spreading the word about it at security conferences. Beyond her work in cybersecurity, Rachel co-hosts She Does Tech, a platform dedicated to promoting women in tech and highlighting their career journeys. In this episode, we dive whether we are truly managing third-party risks or simply turning a blind eye to key issues. We also explore how to continuously evaluate dependencies on third parties, why adopting an assume breach posture helps frame due diligence, and why education about third-party risks should be integrated into your security awareness programs. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and follow it on your favorite podcasting app or YouTube. It's the best way to avoid missing future episodes. And with that, get ready to hear Rachel's opinions. Dive right in. Hi, Rachel. I'm super excited to have you on the Elephant and AppSec podcast right after the Christmas holidays. We're diving into security topics, and I'm super excited. It's been a bit of time to to plan. I think also on my side, but I think this year we don't know yet, what to expect because already if you look, at 2024, so many things have changed from security perspectives, and now everyone is publishing their predictions for 25, and I'm not sure like how much it's actually going to be true at the end of the year. But I think definitely like one big topic throughout last year was a third party risk, with all the breaches that happened, and I think everyone started to get more familiar with the topic and actually put it, at the forefront. And I think we'll see probably more and more of that this year. And I read quite a lot on this topic, and I think I came across one article about actually Bank of England in Europe that recently withdrew a key rule of actually requiring, third parties to disclose their vulnerabilities and saying that it actually might help threat actors. But, it's kind of controversial in a sense because you want partners that you're working with to know what's wrong with them. You want to keep up to date, but if they don't disclose, you can sleep at night easier if you don't know something, but at the same
Yeah.
time, it can be harder. Like, do you think this decision is actually makes sense? Do you agree with it? What do you think?
Yeah, so the controversial question first.
Yes, of course.
Um, I I have to say it's a really hard one. I think I actually tend to agree with it for the reason that when we're a lot of the vendors that we're using, they're not serving just one or two or even three clients.
Mhm.
They have a lot of clients, and so those vulnerabilities are kind of disclosing vulnerabilities that belong to their customers too, right? Because it's in their pipelines. And so they're potentially exposing customers to risk by communicating those vulnerabilities. And I think that's one of the big challenges in my mind around this area because transparency is so important. Like you said, there's a reason it's controversial, right? Like
Yeah.
we do want to know the vulnerabilities that might impact us. But I also think it's really important that we're trusting our third parties to be a part of our security posture.
Mhm.
And what are you going to do? If you know about a vulnerability that they're working on, there's probably not a whole lot you're going to frankly do to shore things up. What I think is important is when there is something that customer can do. So
Hmm.
if there's a vulnerability that they could, I don't know, make sure that they enforce 2FA on their accounts or whatever it is that would help protect them. I think they should communicate that step that, hey, we recommend you do this. We're looking into a security
Hmm.
issue or whatever. It's hard because this is a whole issue with third party risk management,
Yeah.
frankly, is there's different incentives, there's different challenges, and you do have the challenge of the customer who's going to overreact. You have the challenge of that you're exposing other people. So I tend to agree with it that as a broad rule saying you have to communicate these
Hmm.
puts companies at risk of kind of just going to be violating that rule. But I do think transparency is really valuable. So I don't know if that quite clearly answered that
Yeah.
question. Is that clear? Okay. So yeah, my stance is that I do understand it and appreciate it, but I do think that the vendors should own the responsibility to communicate one after the fact that, hey, this has been resolved, how we know that you weren't impacted or what we've done to try to make sure we know. That I do think should have to be reported. And I do think that if there's anything that customer can do, they're unlikely just to pull all their data out of a system if it has all their data, right? Like that's not a very realistic scenario. It could happen if it's that extreme, but more likely it's this needs to be dealt with quickly. You need to show us that when something happened, you did it quickly. And if there was something I could have done to protect myself that you told me. And
I mean, there can be, doomsday scenarios like what happened last July with CrowdStrike, and a huge organization with
yeah,
so many, suppliers were dependent on, and all the airports stopped and everything. Like you can see like the impact of one tiny thing in the whole basically supply chain in a sense.
yeah. You bring something up though, like that I think is such an interesting case because I think third party risk today wouldn't discover that issue. Um, the way that it's handled, they wouldn't. They would not have predicted it. And to me, I think we'll get more into these topics, but that's not really it's an event that happened. It's not an existing vulnerability that we have to report
Mhm.
out. It's an event that happened. And it obviously, I mean, they did have to report and
And
talk about it, but people found out pretty quick.
yeah.
But that is a case where it's about the companies understanding their own dependencies. And I do think sharing and being open about what third and fourth parties, each vendor needs to be clear about where their dependencies lie, where they're sharing that data. And, of course, there's things like GDPR that say if you're sharing our personal information, then you need to tell us who your sub-processors are. But there's not a lot that has been done to say, hey, if you're dependent on this other third party, you have to tell us. And some companies aren't very transparent about that. And I think that's something that does need to change. So you should know kind of what's in your pipeline of dependencies, really.
And when you start, working with the let's say new vendors, and how do you make sure that they will be, transparent in the future with you? How do you evaluate? Like a lot of things are
Yeah.
going through now security have to fill a security questionnaire, but no one is gonna say that they're bad questionnaire. So how do you make sure let's say from a company's perspective, that your third parties you're working on will actually be transparent with you in the long term?
Yeah, I think about this a little bit like just building relationships anywhere, right? If somebody's transparent with you up front, they're more likely to be transparent with you later. And I definitely don't think the security questionnaire qualifies, right? Like it's a requirement and you don't know who answered it. You don't know if it was answered, but that's not
Hmm.
necessarily transparent.
No.
There's a couple things I think are really valuable. One is having a relationship with the vendor and being able to, whether that doesn't always mean it's directly with the security team, but
Hmm.
can they speak to security? And if they're your biggest vendors or your most critical vendors, I'm a big fan of when I can get on the phone with somebody. And even in 10 minutes, you just know if they care, if they understand security. Doesn't tell you everything's done, but somebody in that organization's paying attention. I
Hmm.
really like that. I can't say it's a broadly used model. People do it, but I've always found that to be the most effective. And I've seen it happen. I've been on the side of getting on those calls, and they ask me three questions. They're clearly not vetting everything about security, but they want to know,
Hmm.
do I understand what I'm doing? And do I care? And then they're like, okay, cool. right? Now they
Okay.
shut your questionnaire, right? And so I think that level of transparency up front is important. And then there's also reputation. You get to know companies that are more transparent. And when you see somebody kind of like, no, I'm not going to give you any information, and then they answer just yes, no to questions
Mm,
that need a lot more, you're probably not going to get a very transparent relationship. So
yeah.
I,
I think
we,
very unlikely. Well, sometimes it's also because of legal teams that say are not allowed to say this in my experience, especially if company is public, then it's long and tough to get any information
yep.
out of them. But it was very interesting what you mentioned about being, within 10 minutes that you're able to evaluate whether someone is not going to be transparent or care about security. Like, what clues are you looking for during those, 10 minutes in the conversation to actually understand that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To me, it's that when you ask questions about really kind of their risk posture and how they're thinking about things,
Mhm.
you can gather whether they're not going to tell you every risk they have. I will say that part is never going to happen. So the
Okay.
level of transparency that we're expecting, and the reason it's the same thing as the conversation about those
Mhm.
vulnerabilities, right? Like you're putting your company at risk by sharing all things. So you have to have that acceptance of you're not going to know everything in their environment. And they don't know everything in their environment. Because let's be honest, like if we work in security, we all know that we have gaps and we don't always know all the things, right?
Yeah, we don't always fix all of our vulnerabilities as well.
Yeah, like there's no world they could get on the phone and tell you like 100% everything's perfect. Or if they did, right there, that's one of those clues that they're not, to be honest. But I think it's really just a matter of being able to ask a few things that are critical about understanding, like with the services they're providing, you know certain risks, right? Do they have the most sensitive data? What are the things that they're thinking about? You get an idea of how they're thinking about security and that there's somebody there who's actually, you're not talking to the CSM, right? The customer
Mhm.
success manager about security, but there's somebody there who's dedicated. Those are things that are valuable to me. So it's just understanding that they can speak to the risk, how they're thinking about security, that they've got a plan. What are they doing next? Or if you can ask about something that's very specific, just pick one topic that can they speak to it when you say, say encryption, like what level is that encryption and what protocols and why did they make that decision? Something like that is going to give you a lot of information about their understanding. Was it a checkbox that something said turn on encryption and I went into AWS and I clicked a button and we're done?
I
That
mean, I think sometimes a lot of companies, but some companies do treat security as a checkbox in general, and
mhm.
quite often also because of compliance. And I think you built like a lot of compliance programs, right? Or you helped other companies build a lot of compliant programs and integrate
Yeah,
compliance within them. And like, how often do you see, third-party risk management treated, as that compliance
sorry, I
checkbox?
kind of laugh because
Yeah.
it's like all the time. I
Yeah.
hate to
I mean,
say,
at
but
least it's honest answer.
I think there's a move to understanding that the risk is very real in third
Mm.
party risk because there's a reason that it gets treated that way. And there's a history of this send these giant questionnaires. They don't add a lot of value. So it's kind of just this cost center, very
Mhm.
resource intensive, and then not producing a lot of value. And we see that we're in an environment that is, with all of the third parties that exist, we're in an environment it's really easy that everybody's an admin, right? So you have this challenge that anyone can go out and like add a plugin. It's really hard and it is expensive and it's hard for security teams to have the controls to actually
Mhm.
control what third parties are coming into their environment. I have talked to people who are like 100% I know all of them and I doubt it. But there are a lot of tools. You can get close. But if you're a smaller company or a younger company or whatever it is, or you haven't just built a strong security program, everybody can just go sign up for things online. And there's so many third parties coming in the door every day. And so it's a challenge. And so it's really easy to go to that checkbox compliance because you're dealing with this big complex thing and you just want to check that box because that's the thing that will get you through your SOC 2 or your ISO or and that's all those require, to be really clear. It's true. So when they're doing that, they just have to have, I looked at my third parties and I had something I did. And I
Mhm.
talk to people all the time, or like, I just looked at a SOC 2, they have one. If you're not familiar, a SOC 2 is a report that gives kind of like a report card. So if you don't read the report card, it might just be that they failed. So
Yeah.
having the report doesn't mean a lot, but a lot of people are just at that level. So it is really, really common. Even when it's a bigger program and they've got questionnaires they're sending out and they've thought this through, a lot of times we see it's that same questionnaire gets sent out to every single vendor, which is really just a
Mhm.
checkbox. It might be a lot more work of a checkbox than just looking at a SOC 2. But that is really the most common approach. And it's, I think, because it's complicated to understand, all of these tools have so many ways that they integrate. There's so many different service types. There's so
Mhm.
many of them to deal with. There's a lot of different stakeholders. You have privacy, compliance, right? Security. There's so many layers to this that it becomes something that you want to shrink down. And it's hard. And when I say shrink down, it's because you do have to choose how much energy can you put into this. And so it's hard to get dynamic and really think about your third parties in the perspective of how do they impact your business and how much energy we put into this and what type of risk we have to think about with each different one. So yeah, it's very common that it gets broken down to a checkbox program, big or small.
When do you have to absolutely, put your energy in this?
When do you have to?
Yes. When does it have to become a top priority and all the efforts should focus there?
Yeah, to me, it goes with your business and what the risks are to your business. So when
Mhm.
companies are really tiny and getting started, they don't put their energy into this, and reasonably, because they just need to get a business built and they don't have time to think
Mm.
about if everything falls apart. Well, everything might fall apart anyways.
Yeah.
But when you're,
Depends on who control, yeah, well, how much money left.
if they're really, when you're really tiny, your focus really is you've got to get revenue through the door, you've got to build your product. There's a lot of risk that you're taking on. This is
Mhm.
probably in that level. I think it's really, really important when you start to have traction, you have customers that are trusting you. Even when, and I say start traction, there are obviously multinational corporations that are absolutely dealing with this, but it's at that point that I think you really do have to start thinking about it, because there are, again, so many third parties out there, and they all are susceptible to being breached.
Mhm.
So the way I look at it is, what you need to start with is understanding, how does this thing impact my business? Am I dependent on them? If so, what decisions do I want to make about that? And it can make sense that I trust them. They're a really well-known, reliable vendor who has lots of backups and redundancy and what have you, and I trust that. And it can be that I need to have a backup, but you have to think about what's that likelihood that this thing goes down, and just that basic process. Maybe it's not
Mhm.
full due diligence, but it's understanding, this is the risk I'm taking by having this vendor, and then what do I want to do about that? There's other ones where I'm sharing the sensitive data and I've got contracts, or you're probably not regulated when you're really small. So that's something to look at for anybody who's in the compliance side and making determinations around third party risk, is how much personal data do I have? Is GDPR something that I myself have to think about? But you probably have to think about it if you're servicing other companies and processing data for them. So there's
I
a,
think you have to think about it, to be
yeah,
honest, on the European level anyway, because it's the
yeah.
law.
Well,
Uh,
if you have very few records as a
yeah.
controller, there's a different thing. But as you're growing, that's the thing, is you rapidly in this world, that's like, you don't have to be very big to be to have the number of records that require that you comply. And then if you're getting data from your customers and it's coming in through your systems and you're processing it, it applies. It doesn't matter if you're one person or if you're a million, you know.
Yeah.
So it is something they have to think about the minute you have that kind of risk. And so you have to think about where you're sharing that data. Do we trust these third parties? Obviously, you scale and grow any security program and you scale any risk program,
Mhm.
but it really starts the minute that you have that kind of dependency from customers, or that you have a dependency on your third parties. And that's early. That's
Yeah.
kind of how we all
Which
start.
is, I mean, it's hard. Sometimes it is hard to start early, and it was very interesting what you mentioned that yeah, it's now very easy to onboard a new tool. You can just do it with one click, and
Yeah.
it just depending on department. Like if it's security onboarding new tool, they kind of think about security. But if it's, let's say, HR that onboards a new tool, or marketing, it's not necessarily people who have that security mindset. And the scope, as you mentioned, companies, they grow sometimes within a couple of years. If there is a rounds of funding, they can double, triple their
Yeah.
size. And the people were not used to think about security when they started, they might start now. But how do you make sure? How do you, with this rapid growth, sensibilize people to this third party risk that they are not used to or don't realize? Like, do you have any advice there?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, and is anything perfect? No, but absolutely one is
Mm.
education, right? We
Mm.
all talk about security awareness. This needs to be a part of that
Mhm.
conversation, right? And there's
Yeah.
there's multiple ways that you can convey that risk to the business,
Mhm.
which does talk about, like, what are the dependencies that we have? If a third party is something we use, even sometimes people focus on this, like your hosting provider, your
Mm.
Google Cloud or AWS or Microsoft. But yes, obviously those are critical if that's where you host your services and you're a SaaS provider. Yes. But there's also dependencies that develop that people overlook. And I think kind of bringing people's attention to some examples will help them that there are plugins that can read all of your corporate email. So
Mm-hmm.
they get this like, oh, I'm just using, like, take a Grammarly as a good example that can see all your corporate email. You're using it for this purpose that seems mundane. You're
Yeah.
going out and but it's important. So one, helping them understand that sometimes when you use these types of plugins, the type of access that they can get. Also helping them think about things like maybe, especially if you're smaller, but even in large organizations, especially with the regulations, your CRM, your sales tools
Mm-hmm.
can become one, big dependencies and really important if that, goes down. Two, it has a lot of data that's regulated, sensitive. And so when they start
Okay.
doing again integrations,
Mm-hmm.
everything has so many integrations. I've seen also like, Slack or Meet, you have this communication and you can think of it as like, oh, it's just internal chat if it went down, whatever. A lot of people are integrating tons of things. I've been in companies where we're running our incident response workflows through Slack. We're getting our security alerts in Slack. We're getting notifications of new, customer signups in Slack. These things that we want to react quickly. So you're building dependencies where you wouldn't have historically necessarily thought of them. And so I think that education is really important. The other
Mm-hmm.
part is enabling your team. So I feel like this is another big fear that I've seen in companies where there's a workflow for the vendor onboarding. There's, hey, you've got to request the vendor, right? And nobody
Yeah.
loves any time they have to go fill out a form or submit a request. But if when they do that, you're not clear on your expectations or have a good process, one, you're putting them into, I don't know what's going to happen here, and it
Mm-hmm.
can take a long time. And two, if you're not helping them, ask them why they need the vendor. What problem is it solving? So that if that vendor is not one that you can trust or use, you help them find that other one that will meet that need. And so they feel like they're coming to you as a partner. I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
really big piece. And that's true in anything in security, right? But like to me, that's such a big part of third party risk is that they see you as their partner to help make sure that they're using secure tools, but that you're not just saying like yes or no. Because if you don't like that third party, you're throwing them back into a like, how do I get this done now? But if you're showing up with this is what you're trying to solve for, and here are some other
Mm-hmm.
solutions, that's always going to help. So education and ease of
Yeah.
process. Yeah.
And yeah, I guess building relationships as well, so it helps
Yeah.
so people can come to you, whenever they need advice, how to understand it, or ask, themselves maybe
Yeah.
questions, how to deal with that. Can you check it for me? Can you please verify that it's safe or secure?
Yeah.
And for you, for example, when you enter a new company, when you start working, with a new client or new companies, what does a typical, third-party risk assessment process looks like? Like,
Yeah.
how would you communicate to them? Like, you might need to actually evaluate, your third-party dynamics or relationships with some of the tools. Like, how would you, you know, tell
Yeah.
them to just firstly, what is, baseline? Are you good,
Yeah.
better above others, or are you worse?
Yeah. So I'm absolutely going to start with the inherent risk, right? There's understanding. I think sometimes companies get into a habit
Hmm.
of there's just a standard thing they do.
Hmm.
And it's really important to scope the work that you're doing because we all have limited resources and time. So to understand how your third parties actually impact your business. So to me, it's always sitting down and going with doing a BIA, understanding what your business does, what it needs to be able to operate, what business functions it operates
Hmm.
to do whatever it does, right? So
Yeah.
if you are now we're in third party risk, that's what we do. We have a SaaS product that we need to keep live, right? You have production, you have releasing changes. And what tools do we rely on? What people do we rely on? What do we need to be able to do that? What kind of money do we need, right? That gives us a little bit of perspective when we're thinking about our third parties. And it's a really important piece, right? Because if they are selling us, pens, obviously we don't
Mhm.
need to include them in our program. So some clarity on that. Like, I mean, that's a little overly
Makes
obvious, but just doing that. So I think that's one thing is figuring out what actually matters. And then it's building out an evaluation standardized. Frankly, just having an understanding of what your expectations of your third parties and how you are leveling them as how
sense.
critical they are to the business, and then having a process. And again, I think one of the best things that you see is a clear and easy process for people to request new third parties that it moves through quickly. A problem that we see a lot is that it's the people themselves who are assessing don't really know why that thing's a risk. They've just created a checklist from some standard. And that's where that creates a lack of trust that like this might be seen as a problem. It's not. It might be really opaque, or I'm not sure when I submit. I see a lot of times like I submit a request and it feels like it just went into the ether. You don't know when someone's going
Yeah,
to
what
respond to
happened?
it, what the process, what happens. So the best program's going to have more communication there and a standard workflow. And hey, like we've received this,
Mm,
we'll be reviewing it. And if
yeah.
we have questions, there's a why, always a why. I think this is something in all GRC security anywhere. Like I'm a big passionate, like start with the why. You should be able
Mm,
to explain to anyone why you're doing this. That is a very helpful piece, right? That goes to the education, but like, why do we have these questions? Why are we concerned about this? Or if we say this is a big
mm,
concern, and if you're going to take this risk, that's actually another piece that I didn't mention. There is often this feeling of like there's an approval that comes, but I think going back to the business and explaining the risk if you're concerned about the third party they're using
mhm,
being built in versus a like they got a low score, this is a problem. Explain to them like if you
mm,
want to use them, because sometimes taking a risk is the right thing. Sometimes we do say there are risks with third parties, but we gain all this,
mm.
right? Like maybe they're going to help us reach a much larger market and for whatever reason, right? Or they're going to help us scale, but we're accepting some risk with them. Like that's something the business has to decide. And so just to also be clear that it's not just a score, it's got to come out as information at the end of the program.
And what do you think if it will be a, security engineer, they want to evaluate those third-party risk internally, but it's still kind of a new thing. If they would need to justify why to their CISO or their CIO, how would they do it? If you could like summarize, for them, because for a lot of our listeners are like those application security engineers, product
Yeah,
security engineers, and this, yeah, it is becoming a very important topic. So how would you recommend them to push that internally?
I would highlight the fact that, there's been a couple of studies, but you see like a lot of studies come out with roughly about 60% of companies will say they've been experienced breaches through third parties in the last year.
Mm,
That's standard. There was just one that came out that like 97% of the largest banks in the US had third party related breaches in the last year. That's insane. Not
yeah.
totally sure the impact or the scope. It was a little limited in what it said, but these are some insane numbers. Needless to say that like this is a problem. I think CISOs probably are very, very, very aware that there is such a
Mm,
proliferation of tools, right? Like keeping track of that is really, really hard. And then there's the issue, like I think CrowdStrike you brought up, that was a great example of there are dependencies in here. And so to me, it's all about shoring up and thinking about when something goes wrong. That's really
mm.
what security is about ultimately.
Unfortunately, it is,
I know,
but
but
yeah,
ultimately, and so I
yeah.
do think like there's a level of trust we
Mm,
need to have with our third parties, but there's really the reason I keep saying this thing where I'm like, go back to the impact to the company comes back to if I know that I have a dependency on Microsoft and they have some dependencies and something could go wrong, I should have a backup plan for what happens or know the risk and have accepted it. That maybe
mm,
I'm dependent on AWS. I had this scenario. We're dependent in a region in AWS. It went down for 4 hours. We had thought about that ahead of time, and the cost of that 4 hours versus the cost of a hot backup made a world of sense to us. We weren't going to pay any money for that 4 hours down. So as a business, you accept that. But
yeah.
if you're, say, an airline who has a dependency and can't get your planes back up, if you're right,
There's a big problem there.
yeah, so you need to make a plan. And I think it's less trying to identify every single, from my perspective, it's less trying to identify
Mhm,
every hole and pretend that you're going to know for sure which third party is going to have an issue. It's knowing that all of them could. The best ones,
mm,
the worst ones, whatever. And so, yes, the worst of the worst we want to carve out. So our due diligence should get rid of the bottom, the ones that we know
mm,
are very likely to have a problem. But the ones who check every single box we could ever think of still get hit. And so when that happens, it's us understanding that impact and planning for that. And are we ready to respond? Have we shared data we didn't need to share? So, if we're sharing
mm,
sensitive data, to me, I don't see this a lot in programs, but going and saying like, oh, they want this data. What's the least amount of data I could actually share with this vendor for them
mm,
to provide the service I need? And I'll give you an example of that. Salesforce has tons of information. And
yeah.
there was a backup that was being a backup service that was going to be overseas, and we can't share all of the data. And up
Mm,
front, the thought was you had to do an entire backup. But when we said, hey, there are some issues with that and certain data we don't want to be passed,
mm,
turns out they don't need to have all that data. So we could take out the PII and actually still have what we were really wanting to be able to capture. And so asking those questions and just preparing for like, how can I reduce the impact if something goes wrong to our business?
Mhm.
And that to me is what third party risk should be more about than trying to identify every gap within a third party's security and, posture.
Yeah. Yeah. You shouldn't try to, micromanage everything and list everything possible, but try to prioritize what's important and what's actually,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of we have a lot of information out there. There's a lot of threat intelligence, and you do need to, our third
Mm,
parties change so much. And this maybe goes to some of the problems that we were talking about earlier, but this that just kind of takes me to our third party risk footprint changes a
mm,
lot because they're using different third parties, right? Like they might
mhm,
change who they're using. So that kind of, if you put your data online, you know that it goes to one company and then to these companies and it balloons out. It's kind of
mhm,
exponential. And that's happening for us as well. But that's changing every day. And then we've moved to a world where most of the online services we have are they're very agile. They're releasing changes every day. There's new features coming out, there's new
mhm,
services, and then there's new integrations happening all the time. So it's a constantly like evolving space. And I think that is a challenge. But I was going to say one thing I didn't talk about is just that continuous monitoring of trying to also that questionnaire thing doesn't work. 'Cause you can't send a questionnaire. We both know it's not really going to give you accurate information.
no.
And then you do it a year later and like, who cares? But I think what's really important is keeping on top of, again, how is this impacting us? And then also looking at, are they getting breached? Are they getting fined for not complying with regulations? Are there stories coming out from people that, there's something going on with this third party? Are they being responsive if I reach out to them? Checking if they're managing their vulnerabilities. That's a big one to me that, I love a bug bounty that I can see that they're actually invested in. That's one of my
Mm,
favorite things to know. Like they're investing and paying attention to when somebody hack them. Because at the end of the
mm.
day, if you're using a SaaS service, probably the biggest thing you care about outside of compliance, right? But from a security perspective, and some is a bad actor getting in first or a good actor gonna let us know about the problem?
It's easy to find out soon enough because it's gonna get published if it's a bad actor.
Right, right.
Even with security research, I think it depends on the company whether they want to disclose that something was being found because they are going to disclose it, after it's been fixed, which can take some time as well.
Yeah. I agree. I was gonna say, but the bug bounty, you can look and see like, are they paying good bug
Mm.
are they paying decent prices that they might
Yeah.
get some attention? It doesn't tell you. And I know not everyone can afford the same thing, obviously,
Mm,
either, but you can see if they're responsive. So there are things that are out there on some of those that'll tell you, like, I've seen ones that say they tend to respond to the findings within 14 days, not mitigate. This is just respond to them.
mm,
That's a long time versus, there are those who respond within a day. And all of these bug bounty programs have metrics out there of like what are expected, good
mm.
practices in a program. So that's why I love those. Not everyone, again, has them or can afford them, but if I know a vendor has one and that they're paying attention to it, it makes me feel better.
I mean, it should be because at least they're doing something, at least
Yeah,
finding and fixing at least some of their vulnerabilities that are there. But let's say
yeah,
they're actually like a good vendor, have bug bounty program, they follow, let's say they have security team in place, security teams also may be active, and they publish everything that they implemented. You see, they also build relationships with the developers on the other side, apart from implementing some tools. And this vendor is critical, to you. And then suddenly they decide you as a client, you ask them like, hey, we need to run an audit for let's say compliance reasons, or can you provide us a full list of dependencies that they're using, and they're pushing back on it. How do you think companies should respond to those vendors actually pushing back? And did it happen to you actually personally in your experience?
yeah. So I will say one, this is something I hear about all the time.
Hmm.
It is a challenge. um,
Okay,
because
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a challenge because I think it's setting expectations. So I'll give you an example. I've heard a lot of people talk about some of these big cloud providers who aren't going to let you do an audit and aren't going to respond to your security questionnaires. And that to me is you have to kind of draw your boundary that all of
Mm.
those large cloud providers also make available to all of their customers huge kind of trust centers with lots of different standards and audits and their external audits. And I
Mm.
think you have to accept that that's the level of transparency you're going to get. You're not
Maybe
going to
from
go further.
AWS.
Yes, that's what
You're
I mean.
not
These
going
like
to
large
start.
cloud providers, like let's be realistic. Now,
Yeah.
I will say if you spend enough with them, and I've been in that situation where they will fill out a questionnaire, which is amazing, but that's not very common. I do think you need to hold the line that you have certain agreements in place that if you're not protecting your business and your clients, let's just say like HIPAA, you need to have a BAA. That's just not acceptable. And I think all of them will sign those types of things. I've heard people say they don't, they do. So you need to make sure they're meeting those standards, but they tend to make that available and there is transparency. It's just you don't get to send your own questionnaire. You're going to have to accept that, but it doesn't mean there's not some sharing going on there. With the critical vendors, I have not personally run into outside of those kind of large, very large kind of
Okay.
cloud providers. I've not run into somebody who won't respond. They may not be willing to answer a 400 question questionnaire, but almost all companies at this point have some level of, and especially if they know they've got kind of this dependency they're building with their clients, they're going to have a SOC 2, they're going to have an ISO, they may have a security white paper. There's a lot of that stuff out there, and they'll often respond to some questions, right? And so I have not run into it a lot, but I hear about it a lot, and I mostly what I hear about is people wanting to be able to send their own questionnaire or to have something where they go on site. I do think the pen testing one is actually something that we haven't talked about a lot, but I think it's really interesting that kind of going to that bug bounty side. I would love to see the world change a little bit where I am similar to that vulnerability question. Yeah, maybe your customers don't see the results of the pen test in real time, even though they're helping pay for it. But I would love to see a world where, as consumers, we are helping our vendors invest in doing regular pen testing, not the once a year, but or a bug bounty. That if part of me is like, you know what, throw some money that way. If you have the money, throw a little bit at, if it's a smaller company. But that type of thing, I think it would be really, really valuable that we're just helping everybody find their vulnerabilities and do better. But that's kind of my little idealistic world that we all do that.
It
Um,
can be community security research because sometimes if you do
yeah,
it not as a pen tester, but something is more like from research perspective, then it's something that can be done also for free in a
I
sense.
I think this would be brilliant because I would love to see security postures rise and to have that's where, to me, for these SaaS solutions, that's one of the
Mm,
biggest things we need to worry about. I would say that if there's a critical vendor who won't talk to you and doesn't provide any of that type of
mhm,
information, I would take a pause and think about if there's another vendor, frankly. So I don't find that there's a lot that literally just won't respond, but they may
yeah.
have boundaries and you may not get certain questions you wanted answered. But if you have a lack of information to give you at least a decent amount of comfort
Mhm.
with what this vendor is doing, but they're critical to you. I would really think about that is my advice. I would probably consider moving on. Doesn't mean they're going to talk to you, doesn't mean they're going to, let you come in and do your own audit. But if they're not doing audits and transparently sharing information, I'll say
It's a
semi-transparently, won't say,
yeah.
but
Even sharing
proactively,
information.
proactively, maybe
Okay.
not transparently. If they're not proactively sharing information and they won't let you talk to them or do an audit of any
Mhm.
kind, then I would have concerns.
I mean, I think it's totally understandable because if people are
Yeah.
not, honest to you in such important topics,
Yeah.
especially if they're not going to be honest with you in the future. I've saw that you've also done a lot of talks and you've written about the concept of the assume breach. Can you tell a little
Yeah.
bit more what it is and
Yeah.
what it,
I mean,
how do you incorporate, how it's related to the third party risk?
yeah. I mean, we've kind of talked about it a little bit, not directly, but in this
Yeah.
conversation,
Yeah.
that the assume breach posture, some people find it a little scary that it's like
Mhm.
assume breach, but it's the reality that we see these companies, if you go and look at all of the breaches that have happened, there are names that we all know and lots of them that we all love. Very much, trying to do the right thing, and they have the resources, they have security teams, they have all of the certifications, they are dedicated to some of them trying to secure us and
Mhm.
they're getting breached. And so the assume breach posture is just saying, hey, like at the end of the day, you have to look at your third parties and assume that they may be breached. Let's say may. We'll stick that in there, right? They're not all breached, but
Cross the
you know,
fingers, they're never going to be finished.
yeah, like you're hoping, but you have to look at each one and think about them as assume that they are breached. They are compromised right now. What am I going to do about this and how am I going to handle them? And I think that exercise actually really helps frame the due diligence that you need to do. Because if you look and say, okay, they're breached, I've got data with them, what am I going to do? What am I worried about? That's going to tell you what you need to ask them about on their security posture. It's going to help you frame that. It's also going to help you make decisions about, again, what's that impact to us as a business.
Yeah.
So the idea behind the assume breach posture, from the way I look at this for third parties, is we need to know who our third parties are to assume their breach. So we need to know our inventory. Then we need to think about the impact to the business that this third party brings. And then we also need to prepare for, what do we do if something goes wrong? And at times, yes, there are third parties that undoubtedly do, to provide our services, have our most sensitive data. We know that. But so that's not to say like, oh, the impact, try to just take it back and make it go away. Like, you have to use them, but you have to be aware of that risk. And then that's where you frame, what controls can we get in place that would help us reduce the impact. And if something does go wrong, so if we hear in the news or they send us a notice that they're dealing with a breach, and we all pretty much standard is that they don't know if you're impacted yet, right? Like, they're going to wait till they have to tell you, for good reason, not that they're being bad, but you're not going to know right away. But the minute you know that there's something going on with their security, you've already thought about what the impact to you is, and you can start to prepare that incident response. And we know that being prepared, I don't know, like the IBM cost of a breach reports, it's like $1.49 million if you prepare for incidents, right? That is an important thing to do. And as businesses, like anybody in security, we know that being prepared. So you can plan for, what that impact is. You can know who I'm going to have to communicate with. What steps can we take? Can we reduce access? And we can also know at times, like I've been through, when Okta had a breach a long while ago, where it was an admin access could get into, somebody got into, like, not the admin, their support user access into your environment. But so like we knew that we had device trust, that we had 2FA through a different service. We had all these different things. We had monitoring of users. I knew that we were very, very, very likely to be very safe in that scenario. And so you can have put controls in place to help, knowing that, Okta is a great tool. So I don't mean to call them out in the breach world, but they have access to a lot of your tools. They are central and they're really important. And so bringing them in, that it's both benefiting your security, that you've got this, central access and ease of offboarding and onboarding and role-based access control. Like, it's great, but you're creating a central point of failure. And so you think about that ahead of time, right? And that's what the idea is. You think about that and you prepare yourself. And, you can't 100% guarantee nothing will happen, but you are preparing for that world. And so that's the idea of the assume breach posture.
Very interesting. I think it does. It definitely is worth to be prepared for the worst. I think it's even on a personal level, not as a company. I know some security people that adapted even this mindset. Like, I know one security leader who has his basement prepared for the doomsday. I think that's kind of literally the analog for that. Anything can happen.
True. I will say, I don't think in the security world that it necessarily has to be thought of as the doomsday. It's actually a really good way to scope what you're working on, because there's so much in security, so much you could secure, and so many things you could try to do. If you think about, if the worst were to happen, what do we need to do? Then you start to work from there. And so even if you're a really tiny organization, it actually can help you to use your resources wisely and make the right decisions. So you're not kind of like, I appreciate that idea, but you're not like building yourself a basement tunnel, life, whatever. You're not doing extra steps out of the what could happen. Rather, you're thinking like, what are the things that would have the biggest impact to my business? And let me solve for those first. So it's more pragmatic, I hope, in that approach. Does that?
I think it's very hard, to prepare to not be pragmatic in security, because the resources are quite often limited for the scales, especially like for engineering teams. And I always ask this question, towards the end of the podcast, if there would be one piece of advice that you would give to someone young who is just starting, what they should learn and more, about third-party risk management, like what they should really educate themselves about, what would it be?
If they're young and starting in third-party risk management, I think probably the first thing I would say is actually just understanding the many ways that third parties can be integrated into your environment. It's not the world of like just vendors that we go out and we send out an invoice and pay, because that's another thing I see is people think finance knows who all the vendors are. That'll never be true. It's that there are, you have Jira and there are plugins and there's an app store there. You have, mobile devices and there are app stores there. You have your, uh, Google has plugins and a kind of environment of apps that are there. So understanding just where everything can come in, I think is a good place to start. The second thing I would say is that it is about prioritization, and they also need to understand regulations are a big part of this. It's a really big part of third-party risk. It's not all just security, which when I say just security, there's a lot there.
It's not just
But
technical side of things.
yeah, it's really you have to understand how these things might integrate and where they're coming from. You need to understand your business itself. So always ask the question of what matters to this business because it's different for different organizations. And then understand the compliance kind of world and the regulations that might impact you. And I think like you and I said earlier about like say GDPR, like there's almost no world that if you are processing data for one of your customers that it doesn't impact you. So you have to step outside of like, am I regulated? But you need to understand your customer base and what their needs are and how that extends. So I think those three things are probably the starting place if you're trying to start a third party risk program. So maybe just to restate that, like your regulatory environment, your business and what matters to it. What are you processing? What are you doing that matters? And understanding how third parties can get integrated and brought into your world so that you can start to get your handle on that. So yeah, I would say those are probably the three key starting points.
Yeah, I think this are really a good basis to definitely get started, and especially I think understanding how everything gets integrated. Like me, for the person, it's actually very interesting.
I think one thing that we can do as a community, I know I talked about my like ideal world of
Mhm,
this pen testing and whatever, but
mhm,
I think practically speaking, the reason third party risk is so important to me is both the impact to businesses, but also the opportunity for customers and users to influence our vendors to do better with
mhm.
security. And so one of the things that stands out to me is really encouraging your vendors to provide least privilege environments. And so secure by default. And so I look at that as I want a vendor who's going to enable that I can use SSO, that I can have 2FA. I'd love to see more like device trust options, just to
Mm.
be able to build security around your accounts. That's not getting into necessarily what they're doing behind the scenes,
Yeah.
but there's also least privilege. The API thing, obviously all these integrations is a really big deal, but I mentioned a little bit about like data minimization earlier. But if you encourage that, no, if you want to get into our systems, like we need to build an API or they need to have
Yep.
options that they cannot be an admin in that tool to be able to pull the metrics, but that they can be a read only or whatever it is. And some people move that direction, but I still see way, way, way too much of the API that requires that it's OAuth with your admin or what have you. And that's just really bad practice and creates a huge amount of risk. And so I just would really encourage companies in their third party risk program to push and promote that we're actually working towards least privilege and secure by default and asking that vendor, what can I do to secure my account? So that they're really thinking about building their product for security. So
Yeah. I
just
think for
add
sure
that.
when it comes to APIs, it comes with the initial thought when you actually build them that you implement all those practices because when you do security testing, you can identify, sensitive data that's being exposed PI and also if there are any vulnerabilities regarding like who can access the data, but it all comes from the development, right, from the start.
I think it's just a huge opportunity and also an opportunity for everyone to do better is what I would say.
Yeah.
And I think everyone does need to do better. The number of breaches that we're seeing, it's not pretty. Kind of disturbing.
Yeah, yes. Let's hope that as a community we will do
Yeah.
better in
Yeah.
new like since now it's 2025 resolutions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
this
there's
year.
so many great opportunities and this is one of them. And
Yeah.
yeah, as a community, I think we are trying and it's about getting companies to see the ease, making it easy for
Mm,
them to be secure. And so that's a way that when you're
yeah.
integrating these third-party tools, that's a great opportunity to make it by default easier.
Let's hope. And if there would be one book that you could recommend to someone about security, what would it be?
Oh, man, I'm going to suggest because we're talking about third-party risk, I'm going to have to pull up the name, so you might have to go back on this.
Yeah.
Gregory Rasner has done this. Let me pull up his. Okay. So the book that I would say for third party risk is Cybersecurity and Third-Party Risk. It's a third-party threat hunting, and that's by Gregory Rasner. That's used by the Third-Party Risk Association in training for doing a certification in third-party risk management. So I think that is a really good place to start in this world. Maybe not all
Okay.
things in security, but
I'll put the link to it in the description of the podcast. Thank you so much, Rachel, for coming and sharing your thoughts with me. It was a great conversation. It was really fun, and I personally learned and understood as well a lot. And I'm going to research a couple of things just for me. Personally, it's very,
yeah.
very interesting because I work at the smaller company, so there are things that we definitely connect that sometimes we do not understand the
Yeah.
security implications of it. But well, thank you so much, Rachel. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. It was great to see you, and I appreciate the conversation and look forward to catching up in the near future here.